you're not gonna like blame me on how we're talking, right?
All right, everyone, we're gonna get started with the artist discussion. If you want to come listen, we'll be over here in the exhibit gallery. We've put some chairs over here if anybody wants to grab a chair, and if you need one, just come find me. Not enough.
You want to in there further? You can. We can move it.
Okay.
Take it right now.
Wherever you're going.
Would you like a chair as well?
I would.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Erin Pyre. I'm the director here at the Arts Council of White Lake-Nuveen Center. We are so excited to have Taz here and to have his work on display. So he's going to talk a little bit about the show. After his talk, if you haven't had a chance, make sure you go around and look at the work. A lot of the pieces are for sale, so if you're interested in purchasing anything, you can come talk to me. Sue Wink, our assistant director, or Ian Martin, our marketing and events coordinator. So I'll let you take it over, Taz. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, I guess. Before I start though, let me double check my phone's on silent. I don't know for sure. We're good. Well, I'm just gonna do a little brief talk about what kind of works are here, and then if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just ask. I'm more than happy to stop and answer anything. So a lot of the pieces here are stuff I've created anywhere between 2014 to now. And when I was asked to show in this space, I decided to take this opportunity to just show a lot of the stuff that kind of gets lost in my studio space. Because oftentimes when you're an artist, you show a cohesive body of work, right? And that means sometimes stuff that I made for fun off on the side don't get to actually be seen. They just kind of sit in my studio and then just collect dust. So I decided to kind of try to dig through some of those and take this opportunity to show some of those. So some of these have never been displayed in a gallery space. So once I decided which pieces I wanted to show, I was thinking of what do these things have in common? Because in most cases, art shows me a title, right? It just sounds better when there's a title. So oftentimes I do enjoy working with a lot of figurative work. So you see some of these larger ones. Those are what I usually create, the most in my studio space. But even when I work with figurative stuff, oftentimes what I end up doing is using landscape as a backdrop to a certain extent to kind of create a sense of story with them. And if I'm not working on those because I'm just tired of thinking about ideas, I often resort to just painting landscapes and stuff like that always as a way of almost therapy, where it's just I don't have to think too much about the deep meanings. It's just a way for me to enjoy the process. So what you see in some of these walls are stuff that's just purely representational landscapes that were done as more of me just relaxing. And then there's other ones that show figurative stuff that has more meaning. But what I thought about all of these pieces, the main underlying thing that's always there are either the role of us, the human beings, in how we see the environment and or just the environment as in general. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm just talking throughout the whole time. Just know, I teach college, and I always end up with this problem too. I'm talking to all my students, and they just have a blank face and just stare at me. I'm like, "Are you okay?"
We're here. Talk
Okay,
about
good.
your relationship with nature.
So yeah, that's good. Thank you. So I was born in Japan, so some of the pieces you will see landscape that are inspired and or actually referencing the nature that I grew up in. The specific one is actually the one that's up there with the pinwheels, the smaller one. So that one there, that photo, the reference that I used for that image is actually right by where I grew up in Japan. So in Japan, I was surrounded by nature. We were in the middle, essentially in the middle of nowhere. So that's like, especially with the mountains and stuff that you see, a lot of those are inspired by, the place I grew up in Japan. And then when I was 7 or 8, one of those, my family moved to a small island country of Samoa, which is a tropical island country. And I do end up using some of those like landscapes as well throughout my, paintings. In this group, like the one that you notice most likely is the one that's within the frame there. So the tropical like landscape there, that is, referencing more of the environment that I grew up in Samoa. And then somewhat obviously like once we left Samoa, we came to, United States, specifically Michigan. And some of those I'm sure I don't have to explain, like the fall trees and such. You can tell like those are very similar to what you would see here. So again, growing up in different places, landscape was a big part of like what surrounded me. So they do end up kind of impacting how, what kind of images I create. And with the figurative work, like these are from different series. So like this one here and the larger ones, those are from an ongoing series of paintings that I'm creating, which creates a sense of story using figures in the landscape. This one here is a little bit different because this one was from a previous series that kind of worked with more like the sense of light and dark as a duality that creates a sense of, kind of like a dialogue between those things. But even then, like I always try to think about like, okay, we are humans that live in society. Like how are we impacting how are we reacting, how are we influencing the environment? So with these ones, like this one here, there's two light sources, right? We have a man-made light source, a more organic light source. How are we interacting with these? And it's not as much a direct story that it's telling, but it's an arbitrary story that's there as a way to like think about like, okay, what are we finding interesting? What are we doing with our surroundings? It's just like every time I stop, it's just that.
You're good.
Anything else so far? Like, you want to know about?
So the figures,
I teach at Kendall College of Art and Design in Grand Rapids.
so your figures, like, well, especially these three, are they specific people that the pieces are built around, or is it just a model that you kind of are working with?
So it's primarily a model that I'm working with. So these ones, the female tends to be my wife. She's always there and I can take photos. The male models tend to be myself a lot because I'm also always there. But you also notice that the male models tend to have the face covered so that it's not becoming a self-portrait too much. Because oftentimes,
that was the next question.
yeah, like oftentimes, like I've done works where it was more personal, then I would show my face a lot more. But with these ones, oftentimes if I have like they see my name, they see a figure that looks like Asian, they would just assume that it's really more about like myself rather than something that applies to everyone in the way. So I've been trying to think of creative ways to obscure the face a little bit so that it becomes more about a human being as opposed to a specific person. Any other questions?
How about these two?
Okay. These two here. So this one's a little bit on the older side. Well, 2017, I believe, is when I created these. So there was a time where I was working a lot more with more Japanese like symbols and like using Japanese cultural elements as a way to introduce that dialogue. Pieces that were earlier than this actually used a lot more of those things, but those were the one that was more personal to me. The main problem I had was that when you use cultural symbols, it tends to be esoteric. People who only know what that means are the ones that can decipher or understand them. So with these ones, I try to think of stepping back a little bit more, so using them but in a more broader sense so that we can start to kind of ask questions a little bit easier. So in this case, the one on the left is actually a Japanese kid's toy that's based off the Daruma dolls, where your goal is to knock the pieces out without the thing falling down. So it's kind of as a goal, it's very similar to Jenga, where you're supposed to remove things without falling. So I made it into a diptych where even if you don't fully understand the purpose of the Japanese toy there's some similarities that you can still associate even if you are not familiar with that. So I was trying to explore more of that so that more people can, ask the questions and just see what it might mean. Yeah.
Does the word ephemeral work with that?
I think so, yeah. I mean, if it works for you, for sure. I don't know works for you and when you see that piece, I am completely fine. Let's go with that.
I like it.
Yeah. Any other pieces, questions?
Talk
anything?
about the paper making.
Yeah. Okay. So apparently I was requested to talk about the paper making. So I do have 3 paper making pieces. These 2 here and then this one here. So back in Japan when I was attending the elementary school there, we did have like a local paper making place that would come and help elementary students create paper making images every year. So during COVID actually I was at home. I'm like, what am I gonna do with this time at home? So I started like, okay, I'm gonna try paper making again. So I was in my basement trying to figure out like how to recreate that process with the stuff that I could actually gather here. So this isn't the full traditional approach in terms of process, but I tried my best to recreate that to a certain extent. So these are like the paper making, like image-based paper making process. So instead of just making paper with like random stuff added, it's more about like almost creating images, like painting basically paper-based pulp. So these were the successful attempts of those. I also do have a lot of the unsuccessful ones that did not end up having the structural integrity of a sheet of paper and stuff like that. But these are the ones that ended up working nicely, and I do like the softer edges that it creates, and for these ones too, I tried doing some non-landscape based images, but the landscape one just to me felt the most natural, so I ended up doing that on these pieces. Yeah.
I love all your titles, but I especially love that one. How did you come up with that title?
I don't know. I think that one I was thinking for a while, like
What is the title?
The top one here?
Yeah.
A Second of Eternity.
Oh.
So yeah, a lot of titles. For a lot of my pieces, titles actually come from like song stuff, like song titles or lyrics that I like listen to a lot. But that one's actually not one of those. I don't know exactly why.
Because it looks like a second of eternity.
Yeah, that's good. Then I chose the right one. Unfortunately, I can't tell you any more than like why or how I came up with that. But I guess if it makes sense, then I thought the right stuff. Good. Any other questions?
So so you have a very wide variety, right? So you have like a traditional scenery, right? There's landscape with waterfall, but then there's these other ones that obviously have a story to tell. So like we were all, I think, standing around like, what is the story?
Well, this one, but
That one, all of those on the right over there.
but
This
also
one.
decided I didn't need to know. I still liked it.
No, I'm just curious for as an artist, how much of it is there a hidden meaning story behind, and how much is just I'm creating and.
That's what I was saying.
Okay.
I
All
was
right.
talking with her, we were talking about that.
Story-wise, some of the pieces I do have a lot more like direct meaning that I'm like thinking about and trying to create into an image. Some of them, like the one that's on the far right there with the cutout there, like that one has a lot more direct like idea that I was trying to create into an image-based outlet,
Okay.
Some of these other ones are more ambiguous and arbitrary in what kind of story it's trying to tell,
Okay.
but I did want to make sure that, I want something that intrigues people when they see
Yeah,
it, right?
well done.
So oftentimes, like I do end up using like visual framing devices, whatever I can use to separate an image within an image, and juxtapose different things so that there's like a dialogue that happens between that. And sometimes it's more about just like, okay, like what would be fun to introduce in this, or what can I do to give a sense of story. Some of those like things that are more minor in there that I added that's based on my things, like too, like for example, the one on the bottom, the smaller piece down here, in the sky there is like the Southern Cross that's there. Again, that's partially like reflecting on like when you're in Samoa, which is a tropical island nation, that is something that's on their flag, something that is identifying my time there without it being a crucial part in actual piece. So like there is that touch that is reflecting on what my experience is, but not something that needs to be understood by anybody for the sake of the piece.
But knowing about it, it's like, I mean, especially since these are more trees and stuff from around here, it sort of puts that from your past back up in the existence.
So like that's where like again with that piece, like Samoa is a tropical country, it's summer all the time, so for them, things like fall trees or leaves are something that they would never see unless they leave the country. So that's where like I kind of started to juxtapose those things where it's like, you know, what would you see in a snow globe, like as a, you know, like, which again, I feel like snow globes only exist as gifts for people. I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, it just feels that way, right? So I thought it would be kind of good to kind of like complement those things of like, okay, if you were in this specific place, what would you have as a snow globe? And using the snow globe as a visual framing device to separate and juxtapose those images.
And the globes don't have snow on them.
No, they did not. But they, I mean, I just don't know what else.
Well,
to
that's
call it,
interesting,
too,
yeah. Well, no, it's just interesting, the simplicity of different seasons in the
Yeah.
same picture.
Any other? Anything else? Yeah.
I think I have one. This, I don't know what this is. This waterfall. It's like I can hear the waves, but like it can't just be a waterfall. Like it has like, is there like like a meaning to it? Like it's so beautiful. Like it can't just be like you close your eyes and you just like see it. Like there has to be something in it.
I wish I had a better answer.
It's so pretty. Like the rocks, they're so like.
I would say that one's the one that unfortunately has the least meaning, and like really, I just wanted to paint something that looked really nice.
Yeah.
And you know,
It
as
looks
an
really cool.
yeah. And you know, as an artist, like I'm still improving every week. So like sometimes I just want to make things with better skill. And that was one of them where I was trying to like actually, like how do I paint the movement of the water? How do I actually communicate the patterns and texture in the rocks and stuff? Which again, you know, when you don't force yourself to do that, you end up oversimplifying things, and it just, you know, ends up looking nuts.
When
Yeah,
we were
but-
standing over there looking at it, imagining ourselves like in the scene and just relaxing and
Well, you can
Yeah.
add a meaning.
Yeah.
That's up to you. Yeah.
Well,
You
it's
don't have- doesn't have to be
meditative.
That's
my
what art is,
meaning,
right?
yeah.
It's what it
And
is
I
to
could,
you.
like, when I look at it, I like hear the waves. I could like envision actually being there.
That's good. Any other questions? Anything? Yeah.
What is your sense of fish in that picture, for instance?
This one?
Yeah, what are fish? What are they all about?
I don't know why, I guess, as much. I mean, like, with the paper making, like the koi fish in general, like, Japanese things tend to use those as different motifs and stuff, so it made sense in that way. If you're talking about fish on the other piece here, that's completely different. This one here was more about, like, creating a sense of story in, like, okay, if somebody is out in the rain without a care of getting wet, what's something that wouldn't care if you get wet? You know, like, so it was more of that idea of like,
Surrealism,
you know,
contrast.
right, it creates that contrast and like the juxtaposes the opposite of like fish needs water.
Yeah.
Usually grown adults, I feel like, hates getting wet in the rain. I feel like, I mean, I don't wanna speak for everyone else, but I just feel like that's the case. So then like, by juxtaposing those two, like, what happens if you're there just looking at a fish that needs the water while you're getting wet? Like, what does that say as like a human behavior, you know? So it was more about creating the arbitrary, but like a little more of the allegorical side, creating a story that can have a meaning to individuals that look at that.
What about the painting with the pump?
That pump there. So, that one there, I was trying to. I'm gonna go back a little bit in like how my progressions, like as a creative process was. I was very interested in like the surrealist artists, like Salvador Dali. So my older pieces were a lot more surreal in how the images were created. Things morphing, things combining more. Space itself was very like, you know, unrealistic and dreamlike. As I went on, I kind of started to move a lot more in the representational side, meaning, you know, it was more realistic in a way. So like with this one here, like there's a little bit something that seems off, like as reality, but still like they're pretty natural, right?
Grounded surrealism of sorts.
Right, but at some point I was like, I want to go back more into that surrealist style of actually combining things and like, you know, juxtaposing images but in a weird, more dreamlike ways. And that was more of a test piece to kind of see like what can I do with, you know, in manipulating the space more as I work with these things. So like there's a vague hourglass shape with a curtain that creates a different scenery inside and outside. The pump, it was like, well, usually pumps create water. I'm like, what can I do that's not water? That creates that sense of juxtaposition. So to me, it just made more sense to switch that, and then it starts to talk about this idea of like, and it does come back to like how humans impact the environment. Again, there's an overall theme like, well, if a pump that's supposed to actually work with water is now creating sand, what does that mean?
Taz, when I interviewed you, you talked about, I think it was abstract realism. Is that right?
Magical realism.
Magical realism. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means to you? And
yeah. So you're gonna get a super brief art history lesson here, I guess. But just know I'm not an art historian, so there might be stuff I say that might not be as accurate as it can be. Just a heads up. So earlier I mentioned about like starting with like, the inspiration from surrealism that were very dreamlike, right? Generally with surrealist art, there is no rule. There is no, essentially it's all about the subconscious stuff that we can't really understand. But when I started to kind of reflect on things that actually meant more to me, just having stuff that's completely out of this world doesn't let me do that as much. Because you can't have meaning in something that doesn't have a meaning, right? So like, in dreams, not everything can happen with no actual groundwork. Magical realism was an art style that that started happening more in the U.S. in the 1960s, I believe it on. There are some famous artists like Peter Bloom, Paul Cadmus, George Seurat, and a lot of their work actually focused on social issues and things like the idea of like surveillance and stuff that were relevant back in the 60s and 70s. Those things were their way of approaching those things. And what they did was about creating a sense of eeriness or just like sense of kind of like a little awkwardness in the mundane situations or images. So that's kind of like where I start to move from the surrealist approach, and that's kind of like what I was trying to achieve with something like this, where there's a sense of like reality that it's supposed to represent our real space, but there's something that seems a little bit off about it, or something that just seems like not quite realistic, even though it's a real space. And that was like the reason I started kind of going to more the magical realist route, where even with the the figure here, I could recreate that in a physical space if I wanted to, but if you see that, it's like that's not a real image. I feel like, because again, there's that some sense of like awkwardness in the space and the pose or the like what I'm doing that gives it that sense of magical feel to it. And I've been doing that more because a lot of my pieces do reflect on how we exist in the real space, and to achieve that sense of like connection to the real space, I started to kind of reflect into the magical realist style that had that magical quality, but not completely out there, where it's like chairs are completely floating in the air kind of thing. Anyone else?
Can you talk about the chairs that are under the glass domes with the
those
booths?
That one I was just having fun. But that's also where like it does kind of come down to like the surrealist approach of like to make something interesting. Like one of the things I've been trying to like think about is, okay, what are something that I can manipulate in size or placement to create a sense of story. So with that one, I just started with like this idea of like like the footprints we leave behind. What happens if we just do a gigantic booth in an environment? So it was just a very simple idea, but it was just decided, okay, what else can I do to give it that sense of story? So unfortunately, again, I don't have like a super elaborate meaning.
No, but like looking at the scenery, like we're standing here looking at the scenery, and so in some way, like you're creating a stage with the chairs, and that's the audience, and you're looking at the scenery.
And I think for that piece, like I did create that during COVID, so I was like, isolate stuff. It made sense at that time, right?
That's where you're using acrylics too?
Yep, that was I was away from my painting studio, so I was using acrylic for some of those smaller pieces, which
And normally you use oil.
Yeah. All my larger pieces are done with oil. If I have a choice, oil is what I use.
Okay.
Do you use photographs when you're, I mean, are you using photographs of things?
Yeah,
I
like
do
the
use
whole, like,
photo references for a lot of different things. Generally, I rarely do one where it's just like copying it in like a photograph, just because, like at that point you can also look at a photograph. Like,
But I wondered
sometimes-
as you kind of layer these different
Yeah.
images.
I do take my own like reference images and like, you know, obviously like the figure here, like that is like, I did pose for that, but obviously I'm not a stone-based creature. So like there are certain things that I do take references, but I do have to like figure out how am I going to add my creative process to that. But generally, because I do work in a representational way where some sense of realism helps to communicate the ideas, I do take photo references with decent lighting to kind of help with that process.
You had something in your internet thing about melding cultures together.
So my older, like a little bit more of the older work focused on that. So right before like I started working on like these ones here, like I did do a lot of like images where it was creating like, it was a lot more personal and like how is my experience of growing up in Japan, living in a different country for 4 years while I was, you know, when I was young, coming to the US, like the idea of like, okay, who am I if I don't fully belong in Japan, I don't fully belong here, like what creates that sense of identity? So it was, those ones are the ones where a lot of like cultural symbols were introduced to kind of like figure out like, okay, how is my hybrid identity really like created? How am I really reacting to those? But those ones are a little bit more like the older pieces that I have.
So as an artist, again, with having multiple different mediums, right? You do the paper and use oil and acrylic. I mean, what is your favorite? I mean, what is your, I mean, if you, it sounds like, you know, like from a passion standpoint, going back and doing those like things that are really meaningful are.
I mean, oil is my favorite medium.
Yeah.
So if I had to choose a medium that I only, like I could only use one word, like one medium, I would probably use oil. But I also just like baking things. So like there's just, I just start a few things like there's the printmaking piece on the wall and like right behind, right there, like those are printmaking pieces. I mean, there's benefits and differences to everything, you know, and generally, again, oil is my favorite, but I just like learning things and trying things out.
So what do you teach at Kendall? Like what is your focus?
So I teach more like fine art classes, but primarily like drawing and painting is are the ones that I've been teaching the most. But I mean, teaching wise, you know, sometimes you're giving classes to teach that's what the school needs me to teach. So you know, but generally it's been drawing. A lot of like introductory drawing classes, figure drawing, painting, stuff like that.
Well, that's why I was asking the question earlier about like where, like kind of where your heart is on, right? Because like these pieces, right, they are really stimulating for people to come and we're like, what does he mean by that? And it's really interesting. But you're like, you know, I kind of just was trying, you know, like where's the path? Like where, if you were gonna draw like where your heart was, like what would it be?
It's still going to be like figurative pieces, but figurative stuff that still has a sense of narrative and story. So, like, again, I say that, but it's also like, I go through phases a lot. So you never know. Like,
No, I like it.
Yeah. Like I feel like part of it is that figures are one of the harder things I feel like to paint well. So like it's always been like, it's always gonna be a challenge for me, and I do like that about it. But at the same time, like taking reference images, finding models and stuff that's not my wife also takes a lot of work, you know. So like there is like other things that do go into that. Any other questions? Anything? I don't even know like how long I've been talking.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thanks for being here, Taz. There's more snacks and drinks.
Feel free to ask him more questions one-on-one if you want.
Thank you.